By the third week of November, temperatures had already dropped to 11 below zero, and the settlement at Cutter's Bend had not yet finished its preparations. Firewood was being rationed. Children were being pulled from the schoolhouse early. At the northern edge of the valley, 3 families had already burned through half their winter supply before December arrived. And at the base of the hill where the old alderman claim sat, something was happening that nobody quite understood yet. From the road, it looked like a mistake. A squat, half-buried structure with a low dirt roof and a door barely tall enough to enter without bending. No proper timber walls. No shingled peak. Nothing that looked like a home. Neighbors who passed it slowed their horses out of habit, the way people slow when they see something broken. Most assumed she had given up. Most assumed she was building a root cellar and sleeping in the ruins of her husband's old frame cabin. But inside, something no one expected was taking shape. Her name was Clara Alderman. She was 34 years old, and she had not given up. She had simply stopped caring what the road looked like from the outside. They stopped believing she would fail on December 9, 1887. But by then, the storm had already done its speaking. Thomas Alderman died on March 4, 1887. He was crossing the Morrow Creek drainage with a loaded timber skid when the near runner caught a submerged root and the whole rig rolled. The logs came down on him. He was 41 years old. Clara found out 2 hours later when a boy from the Prentice camp rode to the door. She was standing at the stove when he knocked. She set down her ladle and went to the door, and the boy could not meet her eyes. Thomas left behind a mortgage of $340 on the claim. He left behind 11 cords of cut timber that were already spoken for and could not be sold again. He left behind their son Eli, who was 9, and their daughter Ruth, who was 6. He left behind 1 mule, 1 milk cow, 17 laying hens, and no savings. The bank agent in Harlan County was a man named Doyle Pickett. He came to the property on April 12th. He was polite. He explained that the outstanding debt was due by March 1st of the following year, or the claim would transfer. He wrote no threats. He simply stated the terms and replaced his hat and left. Clara stood in the doorway and watched his horse disappear around the bend in the road. The community around Cutter's Bend had a quiet consensus about Clara Alderman. Widows in 1887 Montana did not rebuild alone. They moved to town. They took work in boarding houses or laundries. They sent children to relatives. The expectation was not spoken aloud. It was simply assumed. The reverend at the Methodist Church offered twice to arrange a placement. 2 women from the Ladies' Aid Society came with a calendar of available rooms. Clara thanked them each time. She did not take the rooms. Raymond Teague, who kept the dry goods at McCreary's, said to 3 customers in 1 week that Clara Alderman had lost her sense along with her husband. He was not cruel. He simply believed it. Harold Birch, who had been Thomas's closest neighbor, told his wife that a woman alone with 2 children and $340 of debt owed in winter had no business starting construction on anything. What they did not know, and what Clara had never explained to anyone, was what her father had shown her. Her father, James Pruitt, had been a sod farmer in the Nebraska sandhills from 1861 through 1879. He had buried 2 winters in an earth-sheltered dugout when timber was not available and money was gone. He had shown Clara as a young girl how the ground 4 feet below the surface holds at 52 degrees Fahrenheit in any season. How a properly sealed and partially submerged structure loses heat through its walls at a fraction of the rate of a standing timber cabin. How the mass of the earth itself becomes the furnace and the fire only needs to assist. Clara had carried that knowledge for 15 years. Nobody had ever asked her about it. Nobody had ever thought to. 12:43 p.m. Harlan County had one place where news moved faster than weather. McCreary's General Store sat at the center of Cutter's Bend, and on the morning of October 31st, 1887, it was crowded. The temperature outside had dropped to 4 degrees overnight. Men stamped their boots at the door. Women sorted their orders quickly and left. The wood stove in the center of the room burned through its morning load before 10 o'clock. Clara had come for nails. 16-penny nails, a coil of wire, and 2 pounds of tallow. She set her list on the counter and waited. Vernon Holt did not wait. Vernon Holt was the most credentialed builder in Harlan County. He had framed 34 structures across 18 years in Montana Territory and had survived 14 hard winters in this specific valley. He had an opinion about construction that he considered fact, and he shared it freely. He had seen Clara's site from the road twice already, and he had formed his conclusion. He said it loud enough for the room. "Miss Alderman, I passed your claim yesterday. What you are putting in the ground there will not hold heat past January. Earth walls wick moisture. Moisture freezes. Frozen walls crack. By February you will have a collapsed hole and 2 cold children and nothing else." The store went quiet. He continued. He said her ceiling geometry was wrong. He said her entrance tunnel would funnel cold air directly into the main chamber. He said the thermal mass principle she appeared to be relying on only worked in climates with milder winters. He said she would be back in a timber cabin by February at the latest, if she could afford one by then. Doyle Pickett was in the store that morning. He stood near the tobacco shelf and said nothing. He did not need to say anything. The mortgage he held on the Alderman claim was its own sentence. He had already spoken to 2 buyers who had expressed interest in the land. He was not threatening Clara. He was simply ready. There is a particular cruelty in that kind of readiness. Clara collected her nails from Raymond Teague. She tucked the package under her arm. She looked at Vernon Holt once. She said, "I know what holds." She left. The store resumed its noise within 30 seconds. Vernon Holt told the man beside him that he almost felt sorry for her children. She broke ground on October 3, 1887. Eli was with her that first morning. He was 9 years old, and he carried the stake markers while Clara drove the survey line herself. The structure would measure 22 feet long by 14 feet wide, set 4 feet into the hillside on its north wall so that the earth itself became that wall entirely. The south face would be the only exposed side. The roof would be living sod over a layer of birch bark over salvaged timber joists, 18 inches of total thickness. By the end of the first week, she had excavated the floor and set the foundation stones. They were river sandstone, each one pulled from the creek drainage by hand and sledged up the hill on a plank drag. Eli pulled the rope. Ruth stacked the smaller stones as her mother placed them. Clara's hands blistered on the 6th day. By the 8th day, the blisters had broken and the skin underneath had begun to harden into something else. She stopped looking at them. 2 weeks in, the walls had risen to 5 feet on the south and east sides using dry-stacked limestone packed with clay mortar she mixed herself from creek bed deposits. The mortar cracked twice in the first week of curing. She reset it both times without comment. A falling stone on the 14th day crushed her left thumbnail black to the root. She wrapped it in cloth and kept the clay mixing. She had sourced the iron stove in September. That was the story people remembered most and the one they most misunderstood. The stove had belonged to the Halverson family, who were leaving the territory in August. It weighed 310 pounds. Clara had paid $4 for it, which was nearly everything she had in cash. She had no wagon capable of moving it. She built a timber skid from 2 straight lodgepole pine trunks, lashed the stove to it with wire and rawhide, and dragged it 1.3 miles up the valley road using the mule. It took 3 days. People saw her on the 2nd day. 3 men on horseback passed her on the road where she was stopping every 40 yards to reset the drag skid. None of them stopped. One of them shook his head. That was the image that traveled through Cutter's Bend before she even reached the site. The widow dragging a dead stove up a dirt road. It became a kind of shorthand for a particular kind of stubbornness that people did not mean as a compliment. The stove went into the southwest corner of the shelter. Clara had calculated that a 310-pound cast iron mass in that position, combined with the thermal storage of the surrounding earth walls, could hold ambient temperature in the structure for 6 to 8 hours after the fire went completely cold. She had not read this in a book. She had worked it out from what her father had told her and from 3 nights of observation she had run herself in October, letting the fire die at midnight and checking the temperature every hour with a glass thermometer she had borrowed from the schoolhouse. Her dress hung differently by October's end. Looser across the shoulders. Her cheeks had hollowed slightly. She stopped eating her own full portion at supper and told herself it was because she was not hungry. Ruth asked her once why she was not sitting down to eat with them. Clara said she had eaten earlier. Ruth was 6 and believed her. By early November, the sod roof was laid. Eli packed the final layer himself while Clara held the birch bark courses flat below. He was proud of it. He told her it felt like a house that was also underground, which was exactly what it was. A neighbor named George Fenn passed the site on November 8th. He stopped his horse and looked for a long moment. He called out, "That a drainage project?" Clara looked up from the entrance tunnel she was shaping. "It's a home," she said. George Fenn nodded slowly, looked once more, and rode on. He did not mention it to anyone. He simply could not find the words for what he had seen. 12:45 p.m. The first real test came on November 19th, 1887. It was not the storm. The storm was still weeks away. But the temperature dropped to 17 below zero that night without warning, the kind of cold that arrives in the afternoon as a color change in the sky and becomes something else entirely by midnight. Clara had finished the entrance tunnel 4 days earlier. It was angled 15 degrees off true north, which meant the prevailing wind could not drive straight into the main chamber. The tunnel itself was 6 feet long and 3 feet wide, and she had hung a doubled wool blanket at its interior end that weighed 9 pounds. That blanket alone made a difference she could measure. She lit the stove at 4 in the afternoon and fed it 3 logs. 3. She had counted them deliberately. By 7 in the evening, the inside temperature was 54 degrees Fahrenheit. She let the fire reduce to coals by 9. She did not add wood. She watched the thermometer instead. At midnight it read 48 degrees. At 2 in the morning it read 44 degrees. Outside, the temperature had fallen to 17 below. The difference between inside and outside her structure at 2 in the morning was 61 degrees, produced by 3 logs and the held warmth of the earth itself. She wrote those numbers in pencil on the inside of the south wall, just above the stove. She did not show them to anyone. George Fenn came by the next morning on his way to McCreary's. He had passed the site a dozen times by then. This time he stopped and asked if he could step inside. Clara stepped back from the entrance and let him pass. He was a neutral man, George Fenn. Not a friend. Not an enemy. He was the kind of man who believed what he could touch. He stepped into the main chamber. He stood still for a moment. He removed his right glove and pressed his bare hand flat against the east wall, which was packed earth and limestone. He held it there for several seconds. The wall was not warm. It was simply not cold, which in a Montana November at 17 below zero is a different thing entirely. He looked at the thermometer hanging near the stove. He looked at Clara. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he replaced his glove. "Huh," he said. He left without explaining what he meant by it. Clara returned to splitting her morning kindling. Winter had barely started. The real test was still coming. She knew the difference between a cold night and a blizzard, and she did not allow herself to feel satisfied yet. Before we go further, has anyone in your family ever built something like this to survive? Share it below. These stories deserve to be heard. The real test arrived on December 3rd, 1887. It announced itself the day before with a sky the color of a tin roof and a wind that shifted 3 times in one afternoon, which is a sign the old-timers knew and the newer settlers had not yet learned to read. By the morning of December 4th, the wind was driving from the northwest at sustained force. By noon, the temperature had dropped from 12 above to 6 below, a fall of 18 degrees in less than 4 hours. By 3 in the afternoon, it was 19 below and dropping. The storm did not ask permission. It simply came. It came with the particular intention of a thing that has been building force over 1,000 miles of open plain and has finally found something to press against. Vernon Holt was burning 40 logs a day by December 5th. He had built well by any standard measure. His cabin was tight-chinked and double-doored, and he had 4 cords of split wood stacked against the south wall. But the wind found the weakness in the west corner where the chinking had dried and cracked in September. He had meant to reset it. He had not gotten to it. At night, the temperature inside his cabin dropped to 29 degrees Fahrenheit. He burned more wood. He burned 40 logs the first day and 44 the second, and he was doing the mathematics in his head that a man does when he can see the end of his stack. Doyle Pickett's family was worse positioned. He had a proper frame house in town, but town offered no shelter from a storm that was regional in scope. His stovepipe froze and had to be cleared twice in one night. His water barrel inside the house had a crust of ice by morning. His youngest daughter slept in her coat for 3 nights in a row. At the base of the hill on the Alderman claim, Clara burned 3 logs on December 4th. She burned 3 logs on December 5th. She burned 2 logs on the morning of December 6th when the storm reached its peak. Outside on December 6th, the temperature reached 31 below zero. Inside the Alderman shelter, the thermometer read 41 degrees Fahrenheit. Not warm, not comfortable by any modern measure, but 72 degrees warmer than the air outside the door. Warm enough that Eli did his sums by lamplight without a coat. Warm enough that Ruth fell asleep on her blanket without waking from cold in the night. Warm enough that the water in the bucket did not freeze. The water in the bucket did not freeze on any night of the storm. Clara fed the stove in the evenings and let it reduce by midnight. She woke at 4 each morning and checked the thermometer. The lowest reading she recorded during the entire storm was 38 degrees Fahrenheit at 4 in the morning of December 7th, the storm's coldest night. She wrote that number on the wall beside the others. Then she added 2 small logs and went back to her blanket. George Fenn was trying to reach the Prentice family on December 6th to check on their situation. His route took him past the Alderman claim. He was moving slowly because the drifts had reached 3 feet across the valley road. He expected to find the shelter collapsed or abandoned. He stopped his horse at the base of the hill. Smoke was rising from the short chimney pipe. Thin, steady smoke. The kind of smoke a fire makes when it is not fighting for its life. The darkest moment did not come from the storm itself. It came on the night of December 6th, the 3rd night of the blizzard, when Ruth woke at 11 in the evening with a fever that Clara could feel through 2 layers of wool blanket before she even pressed her hand to the child's forehead. Ruth's temperature was high. Her breathing was fast and shallow. Her skin was dry in the way skin gets when the body is spending everything it has on fighting something internal and has nothing left for the surface. Clara had seen this before. She had sat with her own mother through a fever like this in Nebraska when she was 12 years old. She knew what the next several hours would determine. She had no doctor within 4 miles. The road was drifted to 3 feet in places. The temperature outside was 31 below zero. The mule was sheltered in the small earth-banked animal pen she had built against the east wall of the structure, which shared one wall with the main chamber and stayed at approximately 36 degrees through the storm. Going for help was not a reasonable option. It was not an option at all. Clara made her decision in less than 1 minute. She let the fire go down to coals. Not out, but down. She wanted to know, at the moment she needed to know it most, whether the structure would hold without the fire's active assistance. Whether the earth itself would carry them through the night if the fire failed or the wood ran out or something worse happened and she needed her hands free for her daughter instead of the stove. She needed to know the true bottom of what she had built. She pulled Ruth close against her and covered them both with every blanket in the shelter. Eli was asleep against the north wall. She did not wake him. The thermometer read 44 degrees when the fire went to coals at 11:30 in the evening. 1 hour later it read 41 degrees. 2 hours later it read 39 degrees. At 2 in the morning, with the storm at its full violence outside and the fire reduced to gray ash with one orange thread of coal running through it, the thermometer read 38 degrees Fahrenheit and stopped falling. It stopped falling. Clara lay still and watched it for 20 minutes to be certain. The needle did not move. The earth walls, 4 feet of packed limestone and clay and living hillside, were holding 38 degrees without any fire at all, in air that was 31 below zero on the other side of those walls. The differential they were maintaining was 69 degrees with no active heat source. She reached out and added 2 logs to the coals without sitting up. She did it by feel. The fire caught within 4 minutes. Ruth stirred beside her. "Mama," the child said. "Are we going to be cold?" Clara pulled her closer. She pressed her lips to the top of Ruth's head and held them there for a moment. "The ground is keeping us," she said. "Go back to sleep." Ruth slept. Her fever broke before dawn. By morning, she was asking for water and complaining that her blanket smelled like smoke, which Clara accepted as the best possible sign. The crisis resolved without announcement. There was no moment of relief that looked like relief. Clara simply rose at first light, checked the thermometer, added 2 morning logs, and began heating water for porridge. The thermometer read 43 degrees. Outside, it was still 27 below zero. She noted both numbers on the wall in pencil and said nothing else about the night. The storm broke on December 8th. It did not end gently. It simply stopped, the way a very loud sound stops, leaving a silence that feels like its own kind of pressure. The sky went from iron gray to a pale, cold blue within 2 hours. The wind dropped entirely by noon. The temperature outside on December 9th was 14 below zero. Still dangerous. Still a killing cold for anyone without shelter or fuel. But the violence had passed. George Fenn was the first to reach the Alderman claim that morning. He had told his wife the night before that he intended to go first thing after the storm broke, expecting to find something he would need to report to someone. He had been thinking about what he would say and to whom. He had pulled on his heaviest coat and his bear hide mittens and started the half-mile from his own property at 8 in the morning. The drifts were still knee-deep in places. He broke through 2 of them with his body rather than go around. His breath came in clouds. The cold was the kind that makes the insides of the nostrils stick together on the inhale. He moved steadily and did not let himself think too much about what he expected to find. He came around the hill and stopped. Clara Alderman was outside the shelter. She was splitting wood. Not emergency wood. Not desperate wood. She was splitting next week's wood with the methodical rhythm of someone who is ahead of their situation and knows it. The axe rose and fell in clean arcs. The splits landed in a neat pile. Eli was stacking them against the shelter wall. Ruth was sitting on a flat stone nearby with a blanket around her shoulders, watching. George Fenn stood at the base of the hill for a long moment. He removed his hat. He walked up. Clara glanced at him once and continued splitting. He stepped past her and ducked into the entrance tunnel. He stood inside the main chamber and did not move for what felt like a full minute. He took off his right mitten and pressed his bare palm flat against the east wall. He held it there. The wall held its temperature against his hand the way stone holds warmth an evening after a summer day. Not hot. Not even warm by comfortable measure. But alive with stored heat in a way that a timber wall in this cold was simply not. He looked at the thermometer. It read 46 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside it was 14 below zero. He looked at the numbers penciled on the south wall above the stove. The column of temperatures and dates Clara had been recording since November. He read them without speaking. Then he stepped back outside. He stood in the cold that was 60 degrees colder than the room he had just left. He looked at Clara. "That is warmer than my house," he said. "With the stove burning all night." Clara set the next piece of wood on the block. "I know," she said. Vernon Holt came 2 days later. He came alone, on foot, without announcing himself. He had burned through 2 full cords of wood during the 5-day storm. He had 1 cord and 4 days of usable fuel remaining, and winter was less than half finished. He walked the perimeter of the structure slowly. He examined the sod roof. He crouched at the entrance tunnel and looked at its angle. He went inside and stood by the stove and looked at the thermometer and looked at the penciled column on the wall. He was in there for 11 minutes. Clara knew because she counted. When he came out, he stood in front of her. He held his hat in both hands. "I was wrong," he said. Clara nodded once. She picked up the axe. That was enough. The knowledge moved the way real knowledge always moves. Not in announcements. Not in meetings. One person at a time, arriving at the door with a specific question and leaving with a specific answer. George Fenn came back on December 14th with his son-in-law, a young man named Peter Wick who had claimed 160 acres on the east side of the valley the previous spring and had spent his first winter burning through wood at a rate that frightened him. Peter Wick did not say much. He walked the perimeter. He looked at the angle of the entrance tunnel. He asked Clara one question about the clay-mortar mixture, and she answered it directly and completely. He left with measurements written in a small notebook he kept in his breast pocket. Vernon Holt came back on December 18th. This time he brought a different notebook. He had spent the intervening days rethinking everything he knew about heat retention, and he arrived with specific questions written out in advance. Clara answered each one. She did not lecture. She did not remind him of what he had said at McCreary's. She simply answered the questions he asked and showed him the temperature column on the south wall and let the numbers do what numbers do when they are specific and honest. He came back 3 more times before January ended. By the third visit, he was not asking questions. He was making notes on modifications he intended to apply to his next build. Clara showed him where the clay mortar had cracked and how she had reset it and what mixture ratio she had settled on after the second failure. She showed him the birch bark course under the sod roof and explained why the overlap direction mattered. He wrote it all down. Doyle Pickett came to the property on January 3, 1888. He did not come to inspect the structure. He came because he had a legal obligation to do so before March 1st, and because the mortgage on the Alderman claim was still outstanding. He was polite, as he always was. He walked around the exterior of the shelter and said nothing about it. He stated that the March 1st date remained in effect. He replaced his hat and left. He did not come back. The mortgage was resolved by February 22nd, when Clara sold 9 cords of timber from the back of the claim that Thomas had cut the previous spring and that she had been holding. She walked the $340 into Pickett's office in Harlan County herself and placed it on his desk. He wrote her a receipt. Neither of them said anything beyond what the transaction required. She walked out. The claim was hers. That was the end of Doyle Pickett's involvement in the matter, and it required no drama to end it. By the following winter of 1888, 4 earth-sheltered structures had been completed in the Cutter's Bend Valley using variations of the method Clara had developed. Peter Wick finished his in October and recorded an inside temperature of 43 degrees Fahrenheit on a night when outside temperature reached 22 below zero, burning 4 logs where he had previously burned 38. A family named Sorensen completed a modified version on the north side of the valley using river rock instead of limestone and reported similar results. The idea moved beyond Cutter's Bend the way practical ideas move in places where survival is not abstract. A man from Cascade County came through in the spring of 1888, having heard about the Alderman shelter from a freighter who had stopped at McCreary's in January. He spent 2 days at the site asking questions. By the winter of 1889, there were 11 documented earth-sheltered structures in Cascade County built on the same principles. A surveyor traveling through in 1890 wrote a brief account of the method in a letter to a colleague in the Dakota Territory. The letter was passed on. By 1891, variations of the approach were being used in settlements in northern Wyoming and in 3 counties in the western Dakotas. Clara did not travel to any of these places. She did not write about what she had built. She did not apply for recognition of any kind. She stayed on the Alderman claim and ran it the way she had always intended to run it, which was carefully and without waste. She expanded the shelter in the spring of 1888. She added 8 feet to the east end and improved the ventilation through the roof using a secondary chimney channel she had been thinking about through the winter. The iron stove remained in the southwest corner where she had placed it. She never moved it. It had earned its position. Eli turned 10 that spring. He could set clay mortar to the correct consistency by feel without measuring. Ruth turned 7 and could identify limestone suitable for dry stacking by the way it broke. Clara did not think of these as unusual things for her children to know. She thought of them as the things children know when their mother has been paying attention. The Alderman shelter stood for 22 years. It was used as a primary residence through the winter of 1897 and as a storage structure and cold weather refuge through 1909, when the property changed hands after Clara moved to live with Eli and his family in Cascade County. The new owners understood what they had and did not demolish it. The north wall, the one that ran directly into the hillside, was still intact when a county surveyor documented the property in 1912. He noted in his report that the walls showed no frost cracking and no moisture intrusion despite decades of Montana winters. He did not know whose hands had set those stones. He simply noted that they had been set well. Clara Alderman lived to be 71 years old. She died in 1924 in Cascade County. Her obituary in the local paper described her as a longtime resident and noted that she was survived by 2 children and 7 grandchildren. It did not mention the shelter. It did not mention the storm of December 1887. It did not mention Vernon Holt's notebook or Peter Wick's measurements or the 11 structures in Cascade County or the surveyor's letter to the Dakotas. She would not have expected it to. She had not done those things for the record. The earth does not keep a record either. It simply holds. It held for Thomas Alderman's widow and her 2 children through a storm that reached 31 below zero. It held through the fever night when the fire went to coals and the thermometer stopped falling at 38 degrees and did not drop further. It held through every night after that, quietly and without acknowledgement, the way the ground always holds the things placed carefully within it. Sometimes the difference between surviving and freezing is not strength or pride. It is the willingness to trust what your father showed you when you were young, even when the credentialed man at the general store tells the whole room that you are wrong. The earth does not care about credentials. It holds the same warmth for the desperate and the determined alike. If you want more forgotten stories of courage from the American frontier, subscribe. These histories deserve to be remembered.